So I'm gonna put it simple for y'all guys. I'm not gonna sugarcoat it. There are literally 1,000, yes, 1,000 Pokemon in Pokemon history, basically. And over time, they've been buffed, nerfed, or stay the same. Will Game Freak do these changes? Probably not, because they kind of suck and only care for money. And well, if you've seen Markiplier Smash and Pass video, this video is basically reformatted the same way. I see the Pokemon, I'll say either buff, nerfed, semi-nerfed, or some variety of that. But yeah, every single Pokemon from Gen 1 through 8, because of course, I mean, the new Pokemon, I mean, we don't know if they're going to be buffed or nerfed because, well, they just got released. And the game just released too. So we don't know the real competitive, like, viability and stuff like that. I do know this guy, Golden Gingo, whatever it's called, is pretty overpowered, and Fluttermane Iron Valiant is also overpowered, but that's not the point of the video. I just want to see past videos to see who will get buffed, who should be buffed and nerfed. I'm only doing fully evolved Pokemon, no Megas, because Megas aren't going to be in Scarlet and Violet. I'm not taking into account Mega Evolution or Dynamaxes, none of that. Plus, I'm also doing full Evos only, so I'm not going to be like, I don't know, for example, saying if Chansey should be buffed or nerfed, or Porygon should be buffed and nerfed, because they don't really matter, honestly. Well, they do, but I'm just going to be basically just only doing the full evolved forms of them. So, for example, I won't do Goodbye, but I will do Garchomp. And I will be doing forms, for example, Rodon forms and all that, and all the forms of Arceus. And for each character, I'm just not going to go in depth because this video will literally be 5 hours long if I did that. And I mean, if you're interested in seeing that, you can put it in the comments. But for time, let's just make it simple for now. Now, without further ado, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and let's begin with the video. Venusaur. Slight buff. Charizard. Slight buff. Blastoise. Buff. Beautifly. Big buff. This Pokemon is absolute dog shit. Beedrill. Big buff. Also, absolute dog shit. Pidgeotto. Big buff. For a Pokemon that says that it can go Mach 2 when it's flying in its Pokedex entries, it sure is slow. Raticate. Major buff. Fearow. Major buff. Arbok. Buff. Raichu. Just fine where it is. And I know I did say in the past, like in the introduction, they won't do pre-evolved Pokemon, but Pikachu, I think it's also just fine where it is. The only reason why I'm doing Pikachu is because there's so many forms of Pikachu that at this point, he's just his own Pokemon. So yeah, and some people have been able to use him in competitive play. So yeah, just fine where it is. Sandslash. Buff. Nidoqueen. Just fine. Nidoking. Just fine. Clefable. Just fine. Maybe a slight nerf. Ninetales. Buff. Alolan Ninetales. Just fine. Wigglybuff. Buff. Crobat. Just fine. Vileplume. Buff. Parasect. Major buff. Venomoth. Buff. Dugtrio. Buff. Alolan Dugtrio. Buff. Persian. Major buff. Alolan Persian. Major buff too. Berserker. Buff. As you can tell, we're going in Pokemon Pokédex order. But, for example, Pokemon that have evolved in the future, like Crobat and stuff like that, I'll just add them in, like, with Starter Evolution. So yeah, just want to let you guys know. Golduck. Buff. Primate. Buff. Arcanine. Buff. Poliwrath. Buff. Alakazam. Just fine. Machamp. Buff. Victreebel. Buff. Tentacool. Buff. Golem. buff. Alolan Golem, buff. Rapidash, buff. Galarian, Slowbro, just fine. Maybe a slight nerf, but nothing too big. Slowbro, buff. Magnezone, just fine. Farfetch'd needs a major buff. However, Sir Farfetch'd, also buff. Galarian Rapidash, buff. Dodrio, buff. Duong, major buff. Muck, buff. Alolan Muck, just fine. Cloyster, just fine. Gengar, buff. Steelix, major buff. Hypno, buff. Kingler, buff. Electrode, buffs. For Hisuian forms, I'm not going to rank because we don't actually have a way to find them to rank them competitively. We can in theory, but not in practice. Because, you know, like, there wasn't like a competitive form in Legends Arceus. So in this video, we're just going to leave out all the Hisuian forms. Executor, buff. Alolan Executor, buff. Marowak, buff. Alolan Marowak, buff. Hitmonlee, buff. Hitmonchan, buff. Licky Licky, buff. Weezing, buff. Rhyperior, slight buff. Blissey, just fine. Tangrowth, just fine. Kangaskhan, just fine. Maybe a slight nerf. Kingdra, just fine. Seaking, majors buff. Starmie, slight buff, but it might actually just be fine, not gonna lie. Mime Jr., major buff. Scizor, just fine. Jinx, buff. Electivire, buff. Magmortar, buff. Pinsir, buff. Tauros, buff. Gyarados, just fine. Lapras, buff. Ditto, slight buff. Vaporeon, buff. Umbreon, buff. Sylveon, just fine. Leafeon, buff. Jolteon, buff. Glaceon, major buff. Flareon, another major buff. Espeon, buff. Porygon Z, just fine. Amistar, buff. Kabutops, buff. Aerodactyl, buff. Snorlax, buff. Articuno, buff. Zapdos, just fine. Moltres, just fine. Dragonite, just fine. Mewtwo, just fine. Mew, just fine. Now for Gen 2. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. Magnum, major buff. For Alligator, slight buff. Typhlosion, buff. Furret, major buff. Noctowl, major buff. Ledian, major buff. Aridos, major buff. There's a pattern here. Was every single like early game Pokemon, they usually suck ass. Although they do change this problem in like later installments, which I find pretty cool. Lantern, buff. Togekiss, slight buff. Xatu, buff. Ampharos, major buff. Bellossom, buff. Azumarill, just fine. Maybe a slight nerf. Shudo-Wudo, major buff. Politoed, just fine. Maybe some buff. Jumpluff, buff. Amy Palm, buff. Sunflora, major buff. Young Mega, buff. Quagsire, it's just fine. Honchkrow, buff. Slowking, buff. Galarian Slowking, slight buff. Mismagius, buff. Unknown, major buff. I know Unknown's a gimmick Pokemon, so it's supposed to suck. Wobbuffet, just fine. Girafarig, major buff. Hopefully Girafarig does it some pretty good like justice in like the competitive scene. Fortress, buff. Dunsparce, major buff. Apparently the Dunsparce is actually pretty good, and I find that funny. Gliscor, just fine, but maybe a small nerf. Gramble, buff. Quillfish, major buff. Shuckle, buff. Heracross, slight buff. Weavile, just fine. Ursaring, buff. Macargo, buff. Mamoswine, slight buff. Corsola, major buff. Corsola, major buff. This Pokemon really just sucks ass. Octillery, buff. Delibird, buff. Major buffs actually. It's kind of funny how Iron Bundle is already banned from competitive while base Delibird is just bad. Like you just don't want to use base Delibird at all. But Iron Bundle though, he's literally already banned, and I find that funny. Mantine, major buff. Skarmory, just fine. Houndoom, slight buff. Funny story, I thought this Pokemon was a Gen 3 Pokemon this whole time. I don't know why, I thought it was Gen 3 Pokemon until now. Donphan, buff. Specifically to its stats. Stantler, major buff. Smeargle, it's just fine, but if anything, maybe a slight nerf. The fact that it's able to have every single move, basically, I mean, I think it's just fine, honestly. Hitmontop, buff. Miltank, buff. Raikou, buff. Entei, slight buff. Suicune, slight buff. Tyranitar, just fine. Lugia, slight nerf. Ho-Ho, slight nerf. Celebi, buff. And now with Gen 3. Sceptile, buff. Blaziken, nerf. Speed boost is broken, especially with Blaziken. Swampert, buff. Mightyena, buff. Major buffs. Linoone, big buffs. Obstagoon, just a regular buff. Destox, major buffs. Beautyfly, major buffs. Ludicolo, buff. Like I said, early route Pokemon are usually horrible, but Ludicolo's an exception. Swiftry, buff. Swalo, buff. Pelipper, just fine actually, surprisingly. Gardevoir, buff. Gallade, buff. All I'm saying, Iron Valiant is pretty broken. He also got banned, and I find that funny. Masquerain, big buff. Another pattern is bug types and ice types suck ass. Like, they're the worst types in the whole game, and they've always has been. Breloom, just fine. Slacking, major buff. Change his ability. It's so stupid. I get it. He can technically be broken, but come on. Change it. Shedinja, buff. Ninjask, buff. Exploud, buff. Hariyama, buff. Probopass, buff. Delkitty, buff. Sableye, buff. Mawile, buff. Aggron, buff. Metachan, buff. Manelectric, buff. Plusle and Minun, major buffs. Volbeat, buff. Illuminaze, buff. Roserade, buff. Swalot, buff. Sharpedo, buff. Wailord, buff. Camerupt, buff. Torkoal, buff. Grumpig, buff. Binda, major buff. Flygon, buff. Cacturne, buff. Altaria, buff. Zangoose, buff. Viper, buff. Lunatone and Solrock, big buff. Niche Pokemon like these, as I said, or gimmick Pokemon, they suck ass. Wishcash, buff. Crawdaunt, just fine. Claydol, big buff. Credilli, buff. Almondo, major buff. Milotic, buff. Castform, all forms of Castform need a major buff. Kecleon, major buff. Banette, buff. Dusknoir, buff. Trophius, buff. Absol, buff. Glalie, buff. Frostlass, buff. Walrein, big buffs. It is pretty good in Pokemon Go though. Huntail, buff. Gourbegeist, major buffs. Relicanth, buff. Lubdix, big buff. Salamence, slight buff, but it might just be fine. Metagross, buff. Regirock, buff. Registeel, buff. Regice, buff. Latios, nerf. Latias, buff. Kyogre, nerf. Groudon, nerf. Rayquaza, slight nerf. Jirachi, just fine. Deoxys, all the swarms, they all need a slight nerf. On was Gen 4. Torterra, buff. Infernape, buff. Empoleon, buff. Staraptor, slight buff. Bidoof needs a massive nerf due to sheer power. However, Barbarrel, buff. Kricketune, buff. Luxray, buff. Rampardos, buff. Bastion, buff. Wormadam, all forms of it needs a major buff. Mothim, major buff. Vespiquen, buff. Pachirisu, buff. Floatzel, buff. Sharon, major buff. Gastrodon, buff. Drifloon, buff. Lopunny, buff. Perugly, buff. Skuntank, buff. Bronzong, buff. Chatot, buff. Spiritomb, buff. Garchomp, just fine. Lucario, slight buff. Hippopotas or Hippowdon, buff. Drapion, buff. Toxicroak, buff. Caravine, buff. Illuminace, no. Lumin. This fish Pokemon that no one cares about. Buff. Obama Snow. Or Obama Snow. Buff. Rotoms. All forms need a buff except for Wash, where I think he is just fine. Uxie. Buff. Mesprit. Buff. Alzelf. Slight buff. Dialga. Slight nerf. Palkia. Slight nerf. Heatran. Just fine. Regigigas. Big boost. Especially with slow start. Like, they really need to remove slow start. That ability is so stupid. Giratina. Slight nerf for both forms. Cresselia. Buff. Darkrai. Slight nerf. Fione. Buff. Manphy. Just fine. Shaman. Base needs a buff, however Sky needs a nerf. Arceus. All forms of Arceus just need a nerf straight out. Victini. Just fine. And of course with Victini we start Gen 5. Emboar. Buff. Samurott. Buff. Superior. Just fine. Watchog. Major buff. Stoutland. Buff. Leopard. Big buff. Simisage. Buff. Simipour. Buff. Semiseer. Buff. Masharna. Buff. Ufazant. Buff. Zubstrika. Buff. Gigalith. Buff. Swoobat. Buff. Excadrill. And just fine. Audino. Buff. Conkeldurr. Slight buff. Seismitoad. Buff. Throw. Buff. Sock. Buff. Leavanny. Buff. Scolipede. Slight buff. Whimsicott. Buff. Lilligant. Buff. Basculegion. Major buff. Crookerrock. Slight buff. Darumaka. Buff. Maractus. Big buff. Crustle. Major buff. Scrafty. Buff. Sigilyph. Buff. Cofagrigus. Buff. Caracosta. Buff. Archeoft. Major buff. Remove Defeatus. Garbodor. Buff. Zoroark. Buff. Chinchino. Buff. Gothitelle. Buff. Reuniclus. Buff. Swanna. Major buff. Vanillux. Buff. Sawsbuck. Major buff. Emolga. Major buff. Escavalier. Buff. Amoonguss. Slight nerf. Jellicent. Buff. Alomomola. Buff. Garvantula. Buff. Ferrothorn. Just fine. Clank. Buff. Electros. Buff. Behem. Buff. Chandelier. Buff. Haxorus. Buff. Beartic. Buff. Cryogonal. Buff. Acelgor. Buff. Stunfish. Buff. Galarian Stunfish. Buff. Mienfoo. Buff. Golurk. Buff. Dredagon. Buff. Bisharp. just fine. Bouffalant. Buff, Braviary. Buff, Mandibuzz. Buff, Heatmore. Buff, Durant. Buff. I find it funny that Heatmore and Durant are supposed to be like Predator and Prey Pokemon, and that Heatmore is supposed to be more powerful than Durant. But in competitive, Durant is like significantly better than Heatmore, and Heatmore just sucks ass. I just find that funny. Hydreigon. Slight buff. Volcarona. Slight buff. Cobalion. Buff. Virizion. Buff. Terrakion. Slight buff. Thundurus. Buff. Thundurus. Slight buff. Tornadus. Buff. Tornadus Therian. Slight buff. Landorus. This Pokemon just needs a nerf. Like straight up nerf. This Pokemon basically ruined Gen 8, like competitive play. Along with another Pokemon that I'm gonna show off later. Reshiram. Slight nerf. Kyurem. Base and black are just fine, although I think we should nerf white though. Zekrom. Slight nerf. Keldeo. Just fine. Meloetta. Both forms are just fine. Genesect. Slight nerf. Now for Gen 6. Chestnut. Buff. Delphox. Buff. Greninja. Slight nerf, especially for Ash Greninja. Diggersby. Slight buff. Talonflame. Buff. Pavilion. Buff. Pyroar. Major buff. Florges. Buff. Go-Go. Bath. Pangoro. Buff. Furfrou. Buff. Both forms of Meowstic. Buff. Edgy Slash. Just fine. Aromatisse. Buff. Surpluff. Buff. Malamar. Buff. Barnacle. Buff. Clodsir. Buff. Heliolisk. Buff. Tantrum. Buff. Aurorus. Buff. Halucha. Slight buff. Dedenne. Buff. Carbink. Buff. Gudra. Buff. Klefki. Buff. Trevenant. Buff. Gourgeist. Buff. Avalugg. Buff. Noivern. Buff. Xerneas. Nerf. Yveltal. Nerf. Zygarde. Complete and regular slight nerf, a 10% buff. Diancie. Buff. Hoopa. Regular form buff, complete is just fine. Volcarona. Slight nerf. Now was Gen 7. Decidueye. Buff. Primarina. Buff. Incineroar. Slight nerf. This Pokemon is stupid in doubles, especially with Parting Shot. Like this Pokemon already has a good typing, and his moveset and his move pool is just really stupid. I just hope he gets a slight nerf. Toucannon. Buff. Gumshoe. Buff. Vikavolt. Buff. Crabominable. Buff. Oricorio. All forms need a buff. Ribombee. Buff. Lycanroc. All forms need a buff. Wishy-washy. Soul needs a major buff, but school form just needs a regular buff. Toxapeck. It's just fine. Mudsdale. Buff. Araquanid. Buff. Loranthmus. Buff. Shiinotic. Buff. Salazzle. Buff. Beware. Buff. Disinera. Buff. Comfey. Buff. Oranguru. Buff. Pissimian. Buff. Golisopod. Buff. Palisand. Buff. Pyukumuku. It's just fine. It's a gimmick Pokemon. It's supposed to, you know, doesn't even attack you. It just has like counter moves. It's like basically a special Wobbuffet, if you know what I mean. So it's just fine. Savali. Buff. Minior. Major buff. Kamawa. Major buff. Turtonator. Buff. Togedemaru. Buff. Mimikyu. Slight buff. Bruxfish. Buff. Drampa. Buff. I find it funny in Drampa's Pokedex entry, it says that he burns down people's houses if they get their trainer mad. All I'm saying, we need people more like Grandpa in real life. Delamise. Buff. Tapu Koko. Slight nerf. Tapu Bulu. Just fine. Tapu Fini. Just fine. Tapu Lele. Slight nerf. Solgaleo. Just fine. Lunala. Slight nerf. Neolago. Buff. Buzzwole. Slight nerf. Buzzwole's my favorite Pokemon. Like, I just like his personality. Pheromosa. Slight nerf. Xurkitree. Slight nerf. Celesteela. It's just fine. Cortana. Just fine. Gleslord. Buff. Also, I'm sorry for mispronouncing Pokemon. I mean, there's like literally 1,000 Pokemon, so I'm bound to like mispronounce a few. I just hope y'all forgive me for that. Necrozma. Regular. Buff. Other forms, slight nerf. Magearna. Just fine. Marshadow. Slight buff. Niganagalga. I don't know how to pronounce this Pokemon. Just fine. Stakataka. Buff. Blacephalon. Just fine. Zora. Slight buff. Melmetal. Just fine. Melmetal is an interesting case because it's not considered an Alola Pokemon, nor is it considered a Galar Pokemon. It doesn't actually really tell us what region this Pokemon was in. It was discovered in Pokemon Go originally. It doesn't matter. I consider him a Alolan Pokemon. And next up, with our last region, Gen 8, the Galar region. Inteleon. Buff. Rillaboom. Slight nerf. Cinderace. Slight nerf. Greedent. Huge buff. Corviknight. Slight nerf. Very early Mon, that's pretty good. And I find that kind of funny. Orbital. Major buff. Thievul. Buff. Eldegoss. Buff. Double. Major buffs. Just a small comment, but like, I've been using like a lot of forums and like studying to know which Pokemon was actually good and bad. And there's this website called Smogon that basically tells you how viable they were. And well, I find it funny because in a lot of bad Pokemon, it just straight up, it's supposed to have a description of like the accomplishment it does. But some Pokemon like Double, it just says don't use Double or don't use Cursula, and I find that really funny. Like imagine being so bad in a game that like no one wants to use you. Dreadnought. Buff. Bolton. Buff. Colossal. Buff Appleton. Buff Flapple. Buff Sandaconda. Buff Cramorant. Buff Barraskewda. Surprisingly just fine. Toxtricity. Buff Centiskorch. Buff Grapple Major buff Poltegeist. Buff Hatterna. Slight buff Grinsnarl. Buff Alcremie. Buff Phalanx. Major buff Prenurchin. Buff Frostlass. Major buff. Ice and bug types are probably the worst like typings to have in a game. Like it just sucks. It's all because of this typing basically. Don't Joiner. Major buffs. Ice Cube. Major buffs. This is sad because Ice Cube's probably one of my favorite Pokemon. I know people hate on this Pokemon. I just like him. He's just a funny dude. Indeedee. Both forms. Buff. Morpeko. Buff Copperajah. Buff Dracozolt. Just fine. Artizolt. Just fine. Vicious Ren Pokemon, Dracovish. Slight nerf. Dracofish isn't even a water type Pokemon at this point. He's just Vicious Ren to Pokemon. Articuno. Buff Dralodon. Buff Dragapult. Just fine, but might need a slight nerf. Zacian. Nerf. Zamazenta. Slight nerf. So we all know the problem with Zacian. It's just stupid overpowered. Eternatus. Nerf. Urshifu. Nerf. Zarude. Buff Regieleki. Buff Regidrago. Buff Glastier. Buff Spectrier. Nerf. And Calyrex. Big buffs to other forms, but it also needs a nerf. And that is every single Pokemon who needs buffs, nerfs, and all that. So that is my opinion on every single Pokemon. Now, I thought this would be a 1 hour video, but apparently it's not, but it's okay. However, if you want me to explain in a separate video what buffs and nerfs each Pokemon need to be viable or what nerfs it needs for Gen 9, put in the comments and I'll be glad to do that video in the future. Of course it'll be a 5 hour video or something like that, but I'm willing to do it. I love competitive Pokemon and it's really interesting, and I just like the idea of having a what if scenario if like every Pokemon was somewhat viable instead of, being either bad or really good. Most Pokemon in this game, because of power creep, kind of need a buff, and there's only very few percentage of Pokemon who are really good, which are mostly legendaries. Thank you for watching this video. To the 5 people who are probably hearing this, thank you. I really appreciate it. You don't understand how much I appreciate it. I don't have that many followers or subscribers in this channel, and I just hope for it to grow. Please don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, and have a nice day, and stay safe, because those streets are not safe. Good night.